So we welcome today Bob Hammel, who's going to talk. He's former sports editor for the Herald Telephone, the Herald Times for years. He's here to talk about a couple of local icons, the Bob Knight era at IU, and then Mr. Bill Cook. And of course, actually, Bob Hammel's kind of an icon himself, being a member of the Sports Writers Hall of Fame, I think, and he's written a couple of well-received books. And so everybody knows Bob. This should be one of our better ones. And so, without further ado, Mr. Hammel.
Thank you. I was unaware that there was such a group as this, and now that I do know, you're probably going to have another couple of attendees. I think it's a terrific idea, and I am a member of the Monroe County History Society, as is David Littman. There may be a few others here, and these two organizations, I think, would dovetail with each other quite well. History has always been a fascinating subject for me. Now, there was a day when I thought a little less of it. I should introduce my wife, Julie, by the way. Sweet Julie, that I wrote about a few times, is over here. I introduced her because I'm about to tell about the son she helped raise. That I'm blaming her for this segment. He was a junior at North, and he came across me one Sunday afternoon. I was sitting in my chair reading, and he came across with his thumb about maybe half the way through a textbook. And it was his U.S. history book. And the thumb was there strategically because he said, "This must have been an easy course when you took it." And he was right. And I'm kind of hoping that he has two daughters now, and I hope they have apprised him of the same advancement of history as we go along. And I'd hate to look at their book, their history book, because I have lived a lot of history, and I've truly enjoyed it. But history and English were probably my favorite topics and subjects in class, and literature as an entity, not as a subject. I didn't like literature because it seemed to me I was always reading not to find out what I liked, but trying to guess what the teacher thought was the message of that whole thing. One of my favorite responses to reviews was Hemingway. After The Old Man and the Sea came out, he read the reviews and all the symbolism that was involved in it, and he told a reporter, "The old man is an old man, the sea is the sea, and all the rest of that stuff is baloney." That's kind of the way I looked at literature. But I did love reading the great writers. I think in my day, now one of the things I did get out of literature was in my day, and I'm sure in a lot of your days, we were taught to learn these things by heart. And that's gone out of fashion now. That's considered rote. That's not really understanding what they say. Well, I'm sorry, but I would beg to differ. I think that by committing a lot of these things to memory, they stay with you. And for example, when I was a senior, we read Macbeth. And there's this wonderful passage in there late in the book when the realization of the futility of all the things that Macbeth has done to get to his position, it's starting to dawn on him, and he says, "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, all our yesterdays have guided fools their way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow. A poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, there are so many things packed into that one little segment that still resonate with me. There are a number of book titles right in there alone. William Faulkner wrote The Sound and the Fury. All Our Yesterdays was a magnificent book by a British author. I've always thought if I wrote a memoir, it might be Tales of an Idiot. Because I did cover a whole lot of things that were full of sound and fury and truly signified nothing. But it's a lesson in life that the great authors could leave for us and could stick with you. Now we would also learn 7 years ago those things. They tended to come back to me, things of this nature. When I wrote books, when, for example, Bob Knight was fired, and that led to our writing the first biography with him. And the day he was fired, it ran through my mind how this all paralleled, to my way of thinking, the Mark Antony funeral speech. How friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often served with the bones. I think that has been the case that we've seen with the memories of Bob Knight. I think people do like to remember what they portray as evil. But there were a lot of pretty good things that happened in that. And in some ways, Bob was one of the luckiest guys I've ever known because he got to see close up. He had the best seat in the house to watch the best basketball that's ever been played in the Big Ten. For about 25 years, he's watched that happen right in front of him. And he just happened to be there on the scene when all that was being played. And I happened to be on that scene too, and I relished that. That was a chance to see beautiful, beautiful basketball. And by kids that I knew were good kids who were there to get degrees and got degrees. It was really rather neat that in 2013, just a couple of years ago, it was the 75th NCAA championship tournament. So they ran a survey, national survey, to pick the all-time best player in the tournament, the all-time best coach, and the all-time best team. And the team that was selected in this national poll was the 1976 Hoosiers. And they were brought to Atlanta and honored down there. They wanted to bring the starting five. And Bob, the starting five, said, "That's fine, but we want a sixth guy." And they added Jimmy Cruz. So it was Scott May, Tom Abernethy, Ken Benson, Quinn Buckner, Bobby Wilkerson, and Jimmy Cruz, and Bob. And that was the very first time that group, as a group, had been brought back together. And they really enjoyed that event. But we also had an evening in there where it was just a very private dinner with just those guys, Bob and Aaron, and those guys and their families, and I was there, and that was very special. Just to let me tell you, it was really very special. A couple weeks ago on a Saturday night when Wisconsin won a basketball game, I found it awful hard to sleep that night with a broad smile on my face. But that protected that team as still the last unbeaten champion. There was a lot made of that week leading up to when Kentucky had the opportunity to match that. And CBS was doing the games, and they did some lead-up interviews on the anticipation that Kentucky would be playing for it. And one of the interviewers asked me, he said, you know, Coach Knight has never been a real big fan of Coach Calipari. I think that's fair. And said, what do you think he would think if Kentucky supplants them and they're no longer the last perfect record champion? I said, you're saying, what do I think Bob would say? and she said, yes. I said, well, I think he would probably say, well, we're still the last unbeaten college team. I ran that by him, and he agreed. But there were so many, with that firing, there were so many aspects beyond that opening of the Antony funeral speech. The noble Brutus has told you that Caesar was ambitious. Or so, it was a grievous fault. And grievously, as he answered it. Bob didn't get killed, but professionally he did. That was the end of the road for him, and he knew it. And it was tough to take. And he also said, he was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious. And Brutus is an honorable man, and so are they all honorable men. If I were casting this whole thing, I don't think I'd make a very good Mark Antony because, well, I did have my Cleopatra. We didn't do a whole lot of cruising on the Nile. And I really never had the first desire to take Bob's job. That was beyond my reach. We used to be riding along in the car together and take turns driving. Sometimes he'd be answering his mail, so I'd be doing the driving. And this time he happened to be driving. I made the comment that, it's amazing to me. I've probably seen 2,000 basketball games in my life. And I really find it astonishing how much more you see in a few minutes of a game than I do. And Bob's comment was, as he drove along, well, I'd sure as hell hope so.
Wow.
And I said, but don't forget, I see a lot more in a sentence than you do. But Andy went on, he hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers. Did that and Caesar seem ambitious? Bob brought a lot of money into Indiana University, and he took back something like the 7th or 8th highest salary in the Big Ten at the time when he could have demanded whatever he wanted. And he also insisted that his contracts not include any bonus for achievement, for winning championships, for doing anything. He said, that's what I'm being paid to do. And in one of the last book we did together, Power of Negative Thinking, which that's an interesting thing in itself, because for about 2 years, he was saying, we need to do a book. I said, fine, what? I got the title. It's the Power of Negative Thinking, playing off obviously power of positive thinking. And I said, well, that's a neat title. What are we going to put inside it? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that truly was the way he coached. He coached, first of all, to take away the things that would beat him, the negatives that they were facing in any game, and then to worry about offense, to worry about what they could do to enhance their own situation. But the first thing they had to do was to beat the other guy. So as we progressed with interviews and sitting down and talking, it really did become a topic that was interesting to fill out. For example, you probably wouldn't expect Bob Knight to be quoting from Washington's farewell address, but he was a history major at Ohio State. He used to say that he's become a lot more mellow toward Ohio State, but when they were a big rival, he used to say his parents had dreamed of his getting a college education, and he came very close. He went to Ohio State. And another line in there is, when the poor have cried, Caesar has wept. One of the great things that I always saw in Bob and in Bill Cook, the other person whom I did a biography with, was how they identified with the guys in the bottom rung of the ladder, and how those people identified with them. When the WTIU program on Mr. Cook ran recently, the next day, this is about 2 years after his death, and the next day one of the cooks in the cafeteria, an older lady, came up to her. She had tears in her eyes. She said it was so nice just to hear his voice again. That was the linkage he had with the people at Cook. He didn't ever come across to them as this haughty CEO. He was the guy who worked alongside him. And that was a quality that I also saw in Bob. And to this day, janitors at Assembly Hall will come up and say, "How's Coach doing?" Tell him I said hello. That's the people that truly love the guy and truly miss him today. That's when the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. That's the identification that bonded those. Now, Bill Cook, we both spent 40 years in this town together and knew each other to the degree that we would see each other at an event and shake hands and say, "How are you doing?" And that was all surface stuff. We really didn't know each other, and I didn't. I knew that, but the Cook Company has a manager's luncheon every month, second Wednesday every month, and I have an office in the Cook building, and I don't do a lick of work for them. And I hope I'm the only one out there that's like that, but it may not be. I don't know. But anyway, but I do have an office out there, and that works out quite well. But after I had spoken to these managers in March of 2006, right at the time when Mike Davis had been fired and IU was looking for a coach. And I rather adroitly talked all around that whole subject. I'm sure that's what they wanted me to talk about. That's why they had me there as a speaker, but I kind of dodged it. Well, that wasn't good enough because Bill was there. And as soon as any of the talks were done, the first hand that always went up with a question was Bill Cook. He was sitting over here, up against the wall. And he put a hand up and he said, "Bob, you go back to your office this afternoon, and Rick Greenspan's on the phone." And he says, who should I hire as basketball coach? Who would you say? Well, I kind of played dodgeball and just kind of talked. I said, you know, Bill, I've been in that office every afternoon for the last several days, and he's never called. So I don't really think that's going to happen. And he said, well, what if it did? Well, now I had to give him some answer anyway. So I said, well, I'll tell you what I would tell him. And at this point, he's hired Tracy Smith as baseball coach, and he made one or two other hires. And I said, you've shown me that you have a pretty good feel for what Indiana needs, what works in Indiana. Don't listen to my people, the press. Don't listen to the fans. Don't listen to the trustees. Right in line between me and Bill was Steve Ferguson. And I was quite aware of that. As I was looking at Bill, I could see Steve. And as I said that, there was about a half-second pause, and then the place just exploded in laughter. And poor Steve was there, red-faced. But I said, no, I really mean that. I mean, because I really think too much interference can be a problem. And just pick out the guy that can do the job, and go with your instincts on that. Well, I don't think he did. But the call never came either. So, but anyway, after that luncheon, Bill said, I went over to talk to him, and he said, I'm going down to the hotels this afternoon. This is when the reconstruction of those two great hotels in French Lick and West Baden was just in its early stages. And he was going down there regularly. He said, would you like to ride along? And I said, look, I'd love to, but I can't. I'm committed this afternoon. So I went back to the office, and I got thinking about it. And so I called back and said, look, I'm sure you're going down there other times by yourself, but let me know the next time you're going, and I'd be glad. I'd like to ride along. So we did it the very next morning. It was a Thursday. And I was to meet him at 8 o'clock. Out front of the building, and then I showed up at 5 till 8, and I was late. But we got in the car, and from the Cook Building to Highway 37 is about five minutes. We weren't to the highway yet when he said, how would you like to do my book? Well, I'm a cool, calculating character, and I waited, thought that over for probably a good second and a half, and said, I'd love to do that book. But I'd like for it to be my book. And he said, and I got, he's driving, and I got one of those Bill Cook handshakes. And that was the whole negotiating for that deal. And it worked out phenomenally well. Now, we were down there all day. We came back about 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. He hadn't mentioned this to me. He told two people, Amy, his secretary at that time, she's now vice president, but essentially his office manager, and Jim Heckman, who was in charge of publications, were there to meet him. They didn't have any idea if there was any incipient book coming. And he laid that on me. He said, Bob's going to do a book on me, and he needs an office. He hadn't mentioned that to me either, but it made a lot of sense. So I showed up on Monday morning, and there's this nothing plush, but a very nice office, far better than anything I ever had in the newspaper business. Equipped far better than everything I ever had. I can tell you about my last office in the building, but which was it was the kind of the equivalent of the sewer. It was the lowest. It was the basement floor of the building. And it was in a storage room that was packed with just plain junk. Well, when I retired, they moved me out of sports, of course, because the guy was coming in to take over. They put me out in one of those Dilbert-sized cubicles out in the front office, and that wasn't going to work. I had no room for any of my stuff, and I'm right out there where everybody coming in the door saw me, and they all felt like they knew me, so they'd have to come back and talk. They wasn't going to get anywhere. So my friends, the janitors, for years, I'd been the last guy out of the building. I'd be there till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and they'd come back and somewhere along the line and talk sports. Well, they saw the situation that I had on their own. They went down in the storage room and they went back in the corner and they cleaved out this working area, painted it, carpeted it, brought in files, brought down a computer and did all this and had it ready for me. And so that's where I operated for my last 3 or 4 years there. I told Scott Shores that we had the early American sewer decor with the pipes hanging down. And it was cold in there. I usually had to wear a sweater. But boy, was it private. They had a sign on the front door that led back to it. It said, "Do not turn off the lights on leaving. Mr. Hammel may be back there." So that was my preparation for this office at Cook's. And as I sat down in there and I looked around, I thought, as of Thursday afternoon, somebody else had this office. Somewhere out in this building, I got an enemy. And I mentioned that to Amy just recently, Amy Hawkins Mungle, and she smiled and said, "Yes, and you'll never know who." So I haven't pressed it beyond that. But doing that book was such an adventure, because as I was approaching the end of the deadline I had set for myself, I knew I was working too many hours and too hard, go too far. I didn't want to push myself to a stroke. That was the worst nightmare that I had. So I drew the line at 60. When I turned 60, I'm going to get out of sports. And that happened to coincide with the Atlanta Olympics, the 5th Olympics I went to, and I was able to retire right there. The Olympics ended, I'm done, and we took off. But that was the lead up to this time with when I knew I would be looking for other projects. And I thought at that time that there were 3 biographies that I'd really like to do. One was the one I always anticipated doing with Bob, because we talked about that as the year was on. And one was Bill Cook. Because I thought, I don't know anything about this guy. So I don't think most of Bloomington does either. I think he's this person who somehow parlayed this very, very small investment into a multi-billion-dollar operation. There has to be a story there, and there was. So doing that book got that story out. Well, in the latter part, the very last days of his life, he was very thin, very drawn. It was clear to anybody seeing him that the end couldn't be very far away. And yet, this was Bill Cook. Bill Cook didn't die. He's too tough for that. He was act for other people. Well, he was pushing hard to get his last real renovation project done at the old, what they call it, Central Church, the Central United Methodist Church in Indianapolis on the near north side. Beautiful building, and it hadn't reached the stages of the hotels, but it was really deteriorating, and the money had been taken out of the church, the main Methodist. There was no longer a church there. They transferred to St. Luke's out a little farther north, and the building was simply on its way to decay. And Bill saw in that a possibility. They were always very tight with Indiana Landmarks Company, Incorporated. And Indiana Landmarks did not have headquarters. So Bill and Marsh Davis of Indiana Landmarks got together. Davis, as this book, which just came out, talks about Marsh kind of thinks he entrapped Bill and Gail into getting investment there, but Bill and Gail were way too smart to be entrapped. They saw a possibility there. And what they did, it was the one renovation that he did that didn't bring something back to its former life. This is not a church anymore, but it is the working headquarters of Indiana Landmark, and it does have a restored sanctuary chapel where they can have weddings, they can have art events in the building. There are a number of things that they can do to support themselves and generate income on their own beyond the donations that they get. It's amazingly practical solution to a real problem. On the last Saturday before the dedication, it would be Saturday, April 9th, 2011. Bill and Gail went to that church and saw the first event that was done in there. It was a wedding. It was a woman who was on Governor Daniels' staff, and her wedding. That Bill and Gail see this building that they had recovered in full bloom. It was in beautiful, beautiful shape. And Bill was thrilled to death and remarked about how it was really worth it to do this. So he did see that building. Now, every Tuesday for months, he'd been making the trip up to Indianapolis with Carl, his son, and George Ridgway, the architect, and a couple of other people. And Bill would go through and he had little stick-it things. He'd put it wherever he saw something needed to be better. And that last Tuesday, he still saw things that needed to be better. He still had some stickers around. During that period, for the last basically 2 years of his life, he'd had such a difficult time with congestive heart failure that he had been going to the Cleveland Clinic for a procedure called paracentesis, in which they drained the fluid from the congestion that had formed in the heart because of the weakness of the pumping of the heart. It's a very, very difficult procedure from several standpoints. One of them being that in extricating this fluid, they're also taking out some vital body fluids that had to be replaced precisely. So it wasn't something that the average doctor could handle, but it was also extremely painful. And Bill finally reached the point where he told his cardiologist here and one of his dearest friends, Larry Rink, I'm not going back to Cleveland. I'm not going to make it anyway. There's no point in going through this. I'm not going to have that stuff put in me again. Well, Larry wasn't willing to give up. And so he, by chance, in his own college days, or his own medical school days, had done a stint at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, in a very, very outstanding program. And one of his assignments there was this very area of replacing bodily fluids. So he had a running start on it. He talked to the people at Cleveland, and he worked out a situation where Bill, instead of going up there every month or so, could go to Bloomington Hospital once a week and have this grinding procedure done. Larry did it himself. And Larry talks to me in the book about how tough that was on Bill, about how he would go in at 7 o'clock on a Friday morning every week. and he'd be there for about 2 or 3 hours for this procedure. And then he'd have to stay there and rest until the blood pressure was back up, his body had restored, was back and forth. Normally, anybody at that age, Bill by then was in his very high 70s, that's enough. You go home for the weekend. Bill would go from there out to the office and work the rest of the day on that Friday. Well, the weekend of the wedding, because they were going to be doing that, he actually went on Friday morning and was anticipating being out on Friday afternoon, be ready to go up Saturday morning. Well, that was the first time that the fluid drainage was so vast, it amounted to 6 liters that it took out of it. And the replacement was so technical and so difficult that he did not respond well enough to let him go that afternoon. He had to stay overnight for the first time. But he did get out Saturday morning, and he was back, and he went to that wedding. So the next week, the dedication of Old Centrum was on Saturday, April 16th. He went in on Thursday that week to get it so he'd be out and ready to go. Well, again, the drainage had reached the point where it was so severe that he did recover in time to go home. He stayed overnight. Thursday night, Friday morning, he still hadn't reached the point where he would be released. It happened that very weekend, Larry Rink was in China because Larry is about the #1 doctor in international sports medicine. He developed that interest through the Olympics, and he's a towering figure in international sports. And the World University Games are being played in Shenzhen, China, and that's where Larry was for 4 days of meeting with officials to brief them on what they had to do. And that's the 4 days when this happened with Bill. So, his replacement was John Strobel, who Larry speaks extremely highly of. He's a very, very well recognized doctor, and he was taking care of things. But Bill Cook was Bill Cook, and it was Friday morning, and he wasn't being released. Gail was waiting out front to pick him up. Didn't know that Bill released himself. Got up and just walked out, and she got in the car with her, and she took him home. Well, they had some people coming in for the weekend for the events that were going to happen in Indianapolis the next day. And this is mid-morning, and then they were going to fly into Bloomington Airport. So he said, he told Gail, you go out and pick them up. And she said, and bring them back here. I said, no, take them to the hotel, the Grant Street Inn, and check them in. And then she said, then bring him here. No, take him to see the baby, Carl's baby. And then, well, in retrospect, Gail is convinced that Bill knew he was dying, knew that day had come. And it's not an instinct. She was reasoning it out because Bill was a pre-med student at Northwestern. He knew the bodily function. He knew that when his blood pressure hadn't come back up, when he knew what that meant. That things were shutting down and he wasn't going to last, but he didn't tell her that. And so she went off and did these things and came back in mid-afternoon, about 4:30, and he was gone. Now, I was going to Indianapolis to have dinner with a guy that afternoon. Julie got a call at home, called me, tell me I'm there. And again, what really flashed through my mind was literature. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the poem Thanatopsis, William Cullen Bryant. was one of those things that many of us had to learn by heart, had to memorize. I didn't. But you remember Sylvan Tackett, attorney in Bloomington, who practiced into his 90s. He was John Wooden Vintage at Martinsville. And that was one of the things that Sylvan could deliver the from memory Thanatopsis. And what crossed my mind as I'm riding in that car that day, and just knowledge of Bill is fresh. It's about an 82 word or 82 line poem. The last 9 are the crux of it. Thanatopsis is a Greek word meaning a meditation on death. And it begins, so live, that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan, and when your time comes to die, thou goest not like a quarry slave at night, scourged in his cell. And I always had this picture of this wan, defeated, terrorized man seeing death approaching and screaming and really reacting, as most of us would once we realized that death was coming. But Bryant's poem, that was all familiar to me. I knew that part of it. But I really didn't apply the end of it until considerably later. In fact, just a few months ago, I went back and read it. And it said, thou goest not like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. Now this is after the book has come out, after I finished the book. The book, by the way, was Gail's idea. She called and said, about a year after he died, she said, you did a lot of things these last 4 years that are not in the book. What would you think of adding a couple of chapters and making it a full biography? So that's what I set out to do. And found that there were a number of things in that so many things that he had done, it wasn't going to be was enough to justify a separate book. But the wording of that, approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. And I realized it sounds an awful lot like what I wrote from Gail. So on page 114 of the book, I'm talking with Gail about what she saw when she came home, and she said, this is quoting Gail, Bill was upstairs, lying on the couch. He had taken a shower, put a robe on, and lay down on the couch. He wasn't trying to call for 911. He didn't fall over on the floor or anything. He just took a nap. William Cullen Bryant had said, approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. Couldn't have called the shot any better than he did in a poem that was published in 1817. But scholars have said really dates, he first started putting it together in 1811, 200 years before Bill Cook's death. Those are reasons why, first of all, I admire both those